Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Library on our first real night of spring. We're so glad to have you here, and we're very glad to have spring with us at last. My name is Elaine Didier, and it's my privilege to serve as the director of the library here in Ann Arbor and the museum in Grand Rapids, and my privilege also to welcome you on behalf of David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States. Tonight's program is brought to you by our parent organization, the National Archives, with very special support from the Ford Presidential Foundation. We're very grateful to all of you who are members of Friends of Ford because it is your donations that make possible all of our public programs, education, feature exhibits, and research travel grants that are the genesis of a program like tonight. We are very pleased that the Foundation's Executive Director, Joe Calvaruso, and his wife, Donna, are with us tonight. Joe and Donna are part of that. And also with us tonight is our Deputy Director, Joel Westfall, who moves between the two sites along with me. Joel? Tonight is the beginning of, as we celebrate the centennial, we have a tradition we've started several years ago of celebrating First Ladies and Betty Ford in the month of April. And so tonight's speaker is Jill Abraham Hummer, who has a new book out called First Ladies and American Women. It's a real pleasure for us to have Jill back here at the library because she was a recipient of a Ford Foundation travel grant way back in 2005, conducting research on First Ladies. And tonight we get to hear about the finished product. Dr. Hummer is an associate professor of political science at Wilson College. Her commute takes her through 4 states. Think about that, an hour-long commute that crosses 4 states. And I'll let her tell you more about that. Her research focuses on women in the presidency and in particular American First Ladies. In her teaching, she covers American political institutions, law and courts, and women in politics. She has published a number of scholarly articles in academic journals and also written for various newspaper publications. Her PhD in government is from the University of Virginia, and she is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Allegheny College. Please welcome Jill Abraham Hummer back to the Ford Library.
Well, thank you very much. It is such an honor to be back here. And again, I'll reiterate, Elaine, thank you to the Foundation for providing the initial travel grant that allowed me to come here about 13 years ago to do the initial research on this project. So, I'm thrilled to be back, especially as part of the Betty Ford Centennial Celebrations. And I have to say that I'll just start off on a personal note. So I have to say that out of all the First Ladies, I probably feel the most kinship with Betty Ford. This is a picture of Betty Ford and her young family and Congressman Gerald Ford. Betty Ford had 4 children, and I have 4 young children, so I can relate very much to this picture. And we all know that Betty Ford was, of course, famous for her candor, and I really found it refreshing how she also wrote and spoke with such frankness about just how crazy life was with 4 little kids running around all the time. So when she said that her son Mike, quote, felt about naps the way he felt about beets, I thought, Betty, I understand. And when during a rainy summer, she let them go to a candy store and play the pinball machine, and then she felt guilty about it because she said it was like teaching them how to gamble. I thought, Mrs. Ford, I understand. And when she said, and with 4 kids, you can forget about order. You just have to hope you don't crack your ankles stumbling over 3 bags of marbles and a Tinker toy. And I thought, Mrs. Ford, I understand. So that's a little summary of why I feel kinship with Betty Ford. But I'm here to talk to you today about my book. It's called First Ladies and American Women in Politics and at Home. And I'll just tell you a little bit about how I got the idea for my book. I actually went to the University of Virginia, as Elaine mentioned, for graduate school, and as Mr. Jefferson's University, UVA is a great place to study the presidents. But when I got there, I kind of looked around and wondered why not quite as many people were so interested in studying the first ladies. And the thing about first ladies, if you're a student of government, as I am, is that they don't have a constitutional role. And so there's the sense, in some circles, not everyone thinks this, but there's kind of a sense that the first lady is a little bit less than, right, a government official. So I started writing these journal articles about first ladies and sending them to these political science publications, and some were warmly received, but I'll be honest, I got some rejection letters back saying things like, who cares about the first ladies, right? What do first ladies really do? But, you know, when I was in high school, the very first time I saw a first lady in person was back in the early 90s, and Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton came to my high school. I grew up in kind of an old steel town outside of Pittsburgh, and my high school happened to have a really big field house. And Hillary Clinton was actually traveling around the country promoting healthcare reform. And so, you know, this was not like a huge formative experience in my life or anything, but that's all to say that I grew up in an era where first ladies did things, right? They did meaningful things, and they performed government roles. And so I just decided that that's what I would spend my graduate school studying, and I spent a lot of time digging around presidential library archives, trying to show how they did actually have meaning in politics and history. So let me go to the next slide. Okay, so Pat Nixon once said that being First Lady is the hardest unpaid job in the world. And she actually said this at a news conference when she was in Africa. She had just endured a 9-hour sleepless plane flight to Liberia, followed by a frantic 12-hour day of state activities. She was actually in Liberia as the Nixon administration's official representative to the inauguration of Liberian President William Talbert. She traveled with an entourage of 40 people, including the Reverend Billy Graham, who was also born in 1918, just like Betty Ford. And Pat Nixon was greeted by a red carpet ceremony and a 19-gun salute, which was normally reserved for a head of state. She rode with Talbert all over the city in an open-air motorcade. She briefed African leaders on her husband's upcoming trips to China and to Russia. And in this picture, she, as an act of goodwill, participated in a tribal dancing performance, and she allowed the African women to wrap a blue tie around her head and a tie-dyed dress over herself. And Pat Nixon pretty much invented the First Lady's diplomatic role. But I think this example from Pat Nixon shows that we actually do have a pretty good reason to care about what First Ladies do and why they do it. And so that's essentially what I set out to explore in my book. In my book, I argue that the story of First Ladies and women in America, two separate stories, cannot be understood apart from each other. I examine the First Lady's changing role through the lens of what was going on in women's politics and history during the time they served. And so my book is really an attempt to weave, I think its innovation is, I try to weave those two stories. On the one hand, the story of American First Ladies, and on the other hand, the story of American women into one single narrative. And I start with Lou Hoover, and I end with Michelle Obama. So Betty Ford once said that becoming First Lady is like being thrown into a river without knowing how to swim. And I think there's definitely some truth to that statement. But I will also share with you 6 conclusions or 6 things that I've learned about the First Lady's role. So how much freedom does she have to define the role for herself? What are some unwritten rules she must follow? What must she do? What must she not do? And you're welcome to disagree with any of those conclusions, and you can tell me about it in the open mic time afterward, of course. So we're here to celebrate Betty Ford on what would have been her 100th birthday. So let's dial back for a second to 1918, the year Betty Ford was born. So what was going on in 1918? For one, I read that fortune cookies were invented that year. But on a more important note, in 1918, Woodrow Wilson ventured to Capitol Hill. We were in the midst of World War I, a quest to make the world safe for democracy. And Wilson's mission on this particular trip to Congress was to ask them to ratify the women's suffrage amendment. He said it was vital to the winning of the war and essential to the spread of democracy. So within a year, Congress did ratify it, and they sent it to the states. And suffrage was important because it really changed the landscape of the First Lady's role. And this is a picture of suffragettes picketing President Wilson outside of the White House. This is very controversial to picket a wartime president. And nearly 60 years later, Betty Ford would become the first lady that we know of, that I know of, to have been picketed outside of the White House. And so we'll get to that later. So in the first section of my book, which spans from Lou Hoover to Jacqueline Kennedy, I look at how First Ladies responded to women's increasing involvement in politics following the women's suffrage amendment, and also how they served to kind of solidify and stabilize families during the years of the Great Depression, the war, and then post-war uncertainty. And so I begin with Lou Hoover, and I think Lou Hoover is really fascinating, and I think she's kind of unjustly overshadowed by her successor, Eleanor Roosevelt. And I'll tell you why. So first of all, Lou Hoover actually had a bachelor's degree in geology from Stanford University, which was highly unusual for a woman of her time. And she was very interested in the outdoors, and she had when she was a young girl growing up, she had a very actively involved father who would take her camping and hiking, and this got her interested in nature and kind of encouraged her to believe in the capability of girls. And so she, later in life, took on a leadership role in the Girl Scouts organization. Lou Hoover was also the first lady to give a radio address. And so she really pioneered new territory here. And this is a picture of Lou Hoover giving a radio address. She's flanked by 2 Girl Scouts. And she's talking to her audience about the things that Girl Scouts were doing in their communities to alleviate the effects of the Great Depression. And so, but I said she pioneered new territory, and this was really because women's voices were heard on the airwaves only infrequently during those interwar years. And so women who did appear on the radio became teachers of the public and voices of authority. They became opinion leaders. And after one of her broadcasts, the Washington Post went so far as to praise Mrs. Hoover's pleasing radio voice. But they also said, and this is a quote, "If most women could hear their radio voices, they probably would never face the microphone again." So because of those perceptions, Lou Hoover actually had a voice tests set up over a sound newsreel in the White House, where she would, she was really, I think, trying to adopt a method of speech and intonation that would help her to blend in future broadcasts a little bit better. And so she also reportedly was not pleased when the reports of those voice tests leaked out to the press. Okay, so this is a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt, and a young Eleanor Roosevelt on the left. She is on her honeymoon in Venice, Italy, and this picture was taken by her husband, Franklin Roosevelt. And on the right is a picture of an Italian immigrant family who lived in the tenements of New York City. In this picture, they're working on patriotic flag pins. The children are between 5 and 10 years old. The baby on the mother's lap is stunted in growth. These children went to school only irregularly, and of course, they lived in total squalor. So let me tell you how these pictures are related. So Eleanor Roosevelt is, of course, a giant among first ladies. And she was tall. She was 5'11", but she was also a giant in terms of what she did, from her weekly press conferences for women reporters to her planned community in the coal mining town of Arthurdale, West Virginia. And she was the first lady to hold an official government appointment in the Office of Civilian Defense. So her husband appointed to her. Of course, she paved the way for Hillary Clinton, to do the same when I heard her as a young high school student. And many people think that Eleanor Roosevelt was far ahead of her time as First Lady, but I don't necessarily think that's true. So the first conclusion from my book that I want to share with you tonight is that each First Lady is a product of her historical time and place. This means that no First Lady was completely ahead of her time, and no First Lady was completely behind her time. The state and city where she grew up, her education, what she did before she was married, and most important, what was going on in women's politics during the time she served as First Lady. All of those things shaped what she did while she was in office. And I like this picture, this first picture on the left, because it reminds us where Eleanor Roosevelt came from. Before she was First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt was a New York City debutante. And Eleanor Roosevelt and her family were wealthy. They moved within the elegant ranks of New York's upper crust. So as a debutante, Eleanor Roosevelt was actually signed up for the Junior League. Back then, it was probably better known by its full name, the Junior League for the Promotion of Settlement Movement. And from the Junior League, and that was really her first exposure to the plight of the working poor. From the Junior League, she got hooked up with the National Consumers League and went into tenements just like this one. The Library of Congress has a really great archive of pictures of New York City sweatshops if you're ever bored and want to go look through them. They're fascinating. But she would go into these sweatshops where, on one of her first visits, she saw these children who were kindergarten age sitting around the table making these artificial flowers. And she saw them just dropping from fatigue and exhaustion. And this is really the thing that turned her into a lifelong advocate for better working conditions for women and children. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about Bess Truman for a little bit. Bess Truman is, I think, very interesting. She's second from the left, in case you didn't know in this picture. And here she is standing in a receiving line with some other Democratic women appointees from the Truman administration. And so this leads me to my second conclusion that I'll share with you tonight, which is that First Ladies must respond to what's going on in their moment in women's political history. Okay, so it's no secret that Bess Truman did not want to be First Lady. She didn't. When reporters asked her, if it had been left to your own free choice, would you have gone into the White House in the first place? And Bess replied, most definitely would not have. And so with Mrs. Truman, I was interested, when I was doing my research, I was interested in her relationship with a woman named India Edwards, and some of you may never have heard of her, but she's the fourth woman from the left. She's the one in the black dress and the black hat. And she was actually head of the Democratic National Committee's Women's Division. And at the time, both parties had women's divisions, which were kind of the nerve center of women's political activity during the post-suffrage years. And Bess was actually known, and I wanted to actually tell you a little bit about Bess that you may not have really heard about. So Bess was known for not liking meet and greets and receiving lines, and this was very true. She did not like meet and greets and receiving lines, but she could only get away with not doing so much. India Edwards really drew her out and made her do stuff. Her time as First Lady is actually filled with examples of her cooperating with India to recognize women who were working in government, which is not something you hear a lot about Mrs. Truman. And I'll just tell you, I have a lot of stories that illustrate this, but I will tell you just one quick story that illustrates this. So Bess Truman's mother was named Madge Wallace, and Bess took care of her mother throughout the years. Her mother wasn't well, and Bess Truman would often shuttle kind of back and forth between Independence, Missouri, and Washington to see her mother, and her mother had a bedroom in the White House. And so Madge Wallace, Bess's mother, actually died in her White House bedroom. She's one of only, I think, 10 known people to have died inside the actual White House, but she did. She passed away there on December 5th, 1952, and so this was right after the 1952 presidential election. And so, but that day, Bess had already pre-committed to receiving volunteers from the Democratic Women's Division. She could have easily said, no, the circumstances are too trying, I'm really not up for it. But she honored her commitment to receive them. And these rank and file party women were just over the moon that Mrs. Truman would take time, despite her difficult circumstances, to come down and tell them, thank you for your work. Thank you for your work in the election. It's so nice to meet you. It made them feel so important and appreciated. They were just gushing afterwards. And this was really the essence of Bess Truman's role and the role of many First Ladies during those post-suffrage years to really encourage and reward women's political participation. Okay, so moving on a little bit in history. Okay, so Mamie Eisenhower. I'll just say something quick about Mamie Eisenhower. Unlike Bess Truman, Mamie Eisenhower was known as this champion handshaker. She could stand in the receiving lines for 10 hours at a time. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but she would just shake thousands of hands and find something nice to say. She was an army wife, and she was an extrovert. I think Bess Truman was very much the opposite. And but Mamie Eisenhower was very charming and loved doing the receiving line thing. Jacqueline Kennedy had zilch interest in doing the receiving lines and doing the teas and doing the lunches and doing the degrees and doing the speeches. And those I'm paraphrasing her own words. So why was this? Okay, so on the left is a picture of Jacqueline Kennedy, and she's standing next to Lyndon Johnson. And she is opening the recently renovated White House Treaty Room. Now, this room is actually on the residence. It's not part of the state floors. You can't really see it if you go on a public tour. And on the right is a picture of me and my oldest daughter. And I really wanted to take her to the White House this year. And so in January, I had that opportunity. We don't live too far away. So I wanted to show her what it was all about. So Jacqueline Kennedy pretty much invented the First Lady Project, and her White House restoration was the first full-on First Lady project. And so one of the things that people ask me all the time about Melania Trump is, of course, well, what's her project going to be? And we can credit those kinds of questions to Jacqueline Kennedy for inventing the thing. And Jacqueline Kennedy did not want to spend her time as First Lady doing, I think, what she regarded as kind of ceremonial fluff. What she wrote one time to somebody she was trying to convince to head the her Fine Arts Commission was to to save the old and make new again. That is terribly important. And so Jacqueline Kennedy made it possible for all of us to experience the White House with the appropriate sense of grandeur and meaning in history. So where did her idea to renovate the White House come from? Well, Jacqueline Kennedy was very smart. She was a student of art, and she was a student of history. And she had been to the White House when she was a young girl. She went there when she was probably about my daughter's age. But she recalled later in life that when she went there, she didn't remember a thing about her tour. She just kind of remembered shuffling through the rooms, but what she really remembered was going to the FBI because that's where they took her fingerprints. She had been to the White House as a senator's wife, and she had actually, and as many of you probably know, it's tradition for the outgoing First Lady to give the incoming First Lady a tour of the White House. Well, Mrs. Eisenhower did that for Mrs. Kennedy, and it's kind of a crazy story, but Jacqueline Kennedy had just given birth by cesarean section, and she had just been released from the hospital and pretty much went right there to the White House for her tour, then on an airplane to go to Florida for the family's Christmas vacation. So she was not in good shape, but she recalled in her oral history that it was at this trip that she knew that something had to be done because what she saw there didn't date, there was nothing of history there from before the big Truman renovations to the White House. So just a real quick history in case you don't know, but soon after the Trumans moved into the White House, one of the stories is that Harry Truman's daughter, Margaret, was playing the piano up in her sitting room, and the piano leg crashed through the ceiling. So they realized very quickly that the White House was literally crumbling beneath their feet, and it was bad once they got in there. But anyway, fast forward to close to the end of the project, when, of course, the government project was running out of money. And they didn't have time they didn't have enough money to just kind of do this full-on redecoration. And so a New York City department store kind of swooped in and said, hey, we'll provide the furniture at cost if you, and interior decorating services for free. And they said, okay, let's do it. And so as a result, the White House looked kind of like a really nice hotel lobby. And very little of historical significance remained. And so Jacqueline Kennedy told journalist Hugh Sidey of Life magazine, she said, "It would be sacrilege merely to redecorate it, a word I hate. It must be restored. And that is a question of scholarship." And it was a question of scholarship for Jacqueline Kennedy. And it was also a matter of public policy for her as well. She spent her, post-C-section recovery reading and requesting books from the Library of Congress and reading up on the White House's history and its furnishings. And it's just amazing to me that she became First Lady at age 31, the third youngest First Lady, that she would just have kind of the initiative and the knowledge to take the lead on this restoration project and take the lead on the publication of the White House Guidebook, which is still in print today. It's still being updated and printed. And found the White House Historical Association, which of course is in charge of preserving the White House as a museum. So This leads me to my third conclusion that I'll share with you, which is that Jacqueline Kennedy's first ladyship shows that first ladies are free to innovate and do what they want. But as we shall see, there are some limits. Okay. So in the second section of my book, and I'll just focus on the Ford years here for a little bit, the second section of my book spans from Lady Bird Johnson through Rosalind Carter, and in this section I look at first ladies and how they moved within the politics of equality and personal issues. And so this is a photo of Betty Ford congratulating Gerald Ford after he signed the executive order establishing the National Commission for the Observance of International Women's Year. And I came across a memo here at the Ford Library that I thought was interesting because it showed just exactly how this ceremony was staged. So the Fords were to start out together in the Oval Office, and then they were to proceed from the Oval Office into the cabinet room where the crowd was waiting. And so the staff, actually, the White House staff wanted Betty Ford to kind of stand behind Gerald Ford as this like conspicuous presence on women's issues, kind of looking over his shoulder as he signed it. And then Gerald Ford was to say a few words about the International Women's Year, and then he was to invite his wife to say a few words, which were completely unscripted. And so Betty Ford put her right hand in the president's left, and she smiled broadly, and then she said, "Congratulations, Mr. President. I'm glad to see you have come a long, long way." And the crowd just erupted, as you can see in the picture. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that Betty Ford was the first lady that we know of to be picketed outside of the White House, that I know of anyway. I should qualify that. It was Phyllis Schlafly, the woman on the right, and her Stop ERA organization that did the picketing. This picture is actually from the Carter years, because she picketed Rosalind Carter too. So the ERA had actually been around since after the Women's Suffrage Amendment was ratified in 1920. It was kind of the next thing on the suffragists' agenda. But nobody really paid attention to it for some years. Actually, Eleanor Roosevelt worked really hard to keep it off the Democratic platforms in 1940 and 1944. She was successful in 1940, but not 44. She was actually really afraid that the ERA would roll back many of the protections she had worked so hard to fight for women laborers. And so she was a big anti-ERA advocate for many, many years. And but still, it was kind of not really on it was not really on kind of like the mainstream political scene until the advent of the women's movement in the early 1970s. And in the early 1970s, everybody wanted to jump on the ERA bandwagon, both Republicans and Democrats. And I think that the male politicians thought that if they didn't throw their support behind the ERA, women would all band together and vote them all out of office. And it was really, though, it had become the emotional cornerstone of that era. And in 1972, Congress actually did ratify the ERA, and then a wave of states followed very quickly. But by the time Gerald Ford got to office, the ERA ratification had stalled. The ERA at that point in time was 5 states short. It had 33 states, and it needed constitutional amendments need 38 states to be ratified. And so I think that Phyllis Schlafly was really responsible for stopping the ERA's forward momentum. She, I think, successfully made the argument that the ERA would force women into the military draft, and this was not popular at the time. And this was actually a point that feminists who supported the ERA conceded. They thought that women had, sort of equal citizenship duties, and they should have to bear the burdens of war. And Schlafly also argued that it would force women to support their families by bringing home 50% of the income, and other kind of economic arguments that turned out to be, pretty powerful. And so Betty Ford did a tremendous amount of behind-the-scenes lobbying for the ERA. She made lots of phone calls and lots of personal appeals to lawmakers in the unratified states. But it put these two women, right, both high-level women in the Republican Party, completely at odds with one another. And when Schlafly got wind of what Betty Ford was doing, she became incensed. She did not think it was the job of the First Lady to lobby for the ERA, but Betty Ford did think it was her job to lobby for the ERA, and she was determined to speak her mind. And I'll just say that based on my research here at the Ford Library, I do think that Betty Ford's ERA lobbying made a difference in the two states that did ratify during the Ford administration, and those were North Dakota and Indiana. But the situation with Mrs. Ford and Phyllis Schlafly illustrates the fourth conclusion that I'll share with you. And that is, First Ladies do have to tread carefully. They can wade into the politics of women's rights here in the U.S., but they have to be quite careful about it. Yes, they are free to speak their minds, and Betty Ford was certainly celebrated for doing so, but if they do, they kind of run the risk of becoming lightning rods for public criticism. And so why is this? Okay, so this leads me to my fifth conclusion, which is that First Ladies must not neglect the home and family. And Betty Ford certainly did not neglect the home and family. She really embraced and celebrated her role as a wife and mother. And this is a picture of Betty Ford at the International Women's Year Conference in Cleveland, Ohio. And it's probably, I would say, one of her biggest speeches as First Lady. And it was the one where she kind of gave her most clearly developed and well-articulated stance on the ERA. And so the ERA was controversial for a number of other reasons. Another reason it was controversial is that it pit feminists against homemakers. There was this perception at the time that if you supported one, you couldn't really support the other. And so Betty Ford was actually quite distressed that homemakers were kind of being devalued in the whole ERA debate. She told her audience here at the International Women's Year Conference, she said, "We have to take that just out of just a housewife. We have to show our pride in having the home and family as our life's work." And Betty Ford once said, and this is something I quote all the time in my own life, "Being a good housewife seems to me a much tougher job than going to the office and getting paid for it." And she also said in an interview with Good Housekeeping magazine, I really like that Betty Ford put the value of a housewife at $30,000 in 1976 dollars. She said, because that's what it would take to hire a cook, a nursemaid, a chauffeur, a doctor, and a cleaning woman. Okay, and Betty Ford actually really did use her platform to be a good role model for homemakers, because homemakers were facing kind of challenging times in the mid-1970s, and this was because of inflation. Everything from beef to sugar cost more, and homemakers were really struggling with how to balance their budgets. And so when Christmas rolled around, and I'll just talk about Christmas because I like Christmas, but when Christmas rolled around, Betty Ford wanted to show American homemakers how to keep it simple. It's a good lesson for all of us, I think. But this is a picture of Betty Ford and Susan Ford, and here they are making homemade decorations in the White House solarium. And so the First Lady gets to pick the Christmas theme. Every year the White House has a theme that kind of unifies the decorations and ties together the ornaments on the trees. And when it was Betty Ford's turn to pick a theme, she picked hand-spun and homemade. She kind of wanted to bring it back to Christmases of yesteryear, like how we used to celebrate Christmas in colonial times with like a few pine branches and some other stuff. But it wasn't, she wanted to she banned everything that was made with glitter and sequins, plastic and foil. She wanted everything to be natural. So now back in the 1970s, people actually used to write to the White House to ask for information about the Christmas decorations, because you could not go to YouTube and watch the First Lady give a tour of the White House or flip on HGTV like you can today. So back in the 1970s, when people used to write and ask for information about the White House decorations, Betty Ford sent them a Christmas mailer in reply. And in this particular mailer, she had instructions for making all kinds of handmade and homemade crafts. So I knew this mailer existed, and I was in the spirit of Betty Ford trying to keep my kids entertained at Christmas one year. So I went to the Ford Library's website, and I downloaded the mailer, and we made the Betty Ford red felt cardinal. And this is the picture of the Betty Ford felt cardinal that I made. Now, it was Betty Ford's idea that women could just kind of go into their sewing baskets and use what they had around the house and put this together. I had to go to Hobby Lobby and get all the supplies because I did not have any of this stuff at my house. But it was really fun. It's one of my favorite Christmas ornaments. I display it every year. But there are so many examples of things Betty Ford did to be a good role model for homemakers during this period of high inflation. She once told a White House briefing on consumers and food that she made sure the president cleaned his plate at every meal. She said, quote, "If they didn't take it away, I am afraid he would eat the plate also." And so, no speech on Betty Ford would be complete without mentioning how she raised breast cancer awareness. She could have easily remained silent on this topic. When Mamie Eisenhower was First Lady and had a hysterectomy back in 1957, it was referred to in the press as, quote, "an operation typical of women her age." And that's it. But Betty Ford believed the time was right to speak out. This was the era when personal issues were also political issues. And Betty Ford decided to allow American women into her hospital room, into her operating room, and into her recovery room. And so I thought I'd just read you a little bit from my book about this particular incident. Okay. So, intimate details of her hospital stay and procedure were covered in the papers. The night before her surgery, she dined on steak and fries, and in the morning awoke to 3 bouquets of flowers from her husband. She donned toeless white operating room socks and joked that they would be featured in Women's Wear Daily. It took doctors only 15 minutes to determine that the small nodule, 2 centimeters in circumference, and immediately fast frozen with liquid nitrogen, was cancerous. In the 2.5 hour procedure, the surgeon removed her entire right breast, its underlying pectoral muscle, and lymph node tissue in the adjacent armpit. This was remarkable information to pass on in an age when breast cancer surgery was little understood by the public. Mammograms were a new technology. And then I go on. Her impact on public awareness was measurable. During her hospitalization, 45,000 letters and cards poured into the White House, and NBC reported that 6 times as many women were seeking breast cancer screenings. So, okay. I really like this picture from the 1976 Republican Convention. I like the symbolism, the contrast between current First Lady Betty Ford and future First Lady Nancy Reagan illustrates just how the Republican Party was changing at the time. Same political party, very different political wives. The Republican Party was a house divided against itself in 1976 on many issues, especially women's issues such as the ERA. Plus, the landscape for political wives had completely changed. Back in 1968, all anybody wanted to know about the candidate's wife was, how much does she weigh? I'm not kidding, they wanted to know. What does she have for breakfast? What are her hobbies? How many kids does she have? But by 1976, just about every aspect of the president and first lady's personal lives, just, do a Google News search for Melania Trump, see what comes up. But I'm serious, every aspect of their lives is now fair game for the public wants to know. They feel like they have a right to know. Betty Ford used to tell the press about how she would try to get her husband to appoint a woman to the cabinet and appoint a woman to the Supreme Court. And so when when Ronald Reagan was running in the 76 primary, I think Nancy Reagan was a little taken aback that reporters would ask her, well, are you going to try to get your husband to appoint a woman to the Supreme Court? Are you going to try to get your husband to appoint a woman to the cabinet? And she would kind of demur on those questions. But when asked, so what was the reason for the change? And when asked, political women would actually cite 3 reasons. Number 1, the women's rights movement. Number 2, Watergate. And number 3, Betty Ford's frankness. So she really did have an impact in, I think, changing the landscape for political wives. And in the last section of my book, I look at how the First Ladies have acted within the highly charged partisan environment around motherhood and family politics. And so this brings me to my 6th and final conclusion I'll share with you tonight, which is that First Ladies must act in concert with the agendas of their respective political parties and their husbands' administrations. And so I would be remiss not to mention Barbara Bush, who of course passed away last Tuesday. I think she's a great example of how First Ladies do oftentimes act in line, especially in kind of post-1980 with her husband's administration and party. So Barbara Bush was not always in line with the Republican Party of the Bush administration. She was sometimes, kind of a little more in line with Betty Ford on a lot of issues, but she didn't speak out on them. The Republican Party of the mid-1970s was very different than the Republican Party of the early 1990s. And it was a completely different moment in women's political history. And so when the press would ask Mrs. Bush about her opinions on controversial issues, this is what she'd say: "I'm not going to tell you. I'm not running for public office. George Bush is." And so I do believe, though, that Barbara Bush's Wellesley College commencement address, which if you were paying attention to the headlines over the last couple of weeks has gotten a lot of attention, I really do believe that that's probably one of the best, if not the best, First Lady speech ever given. So just a little bit about that story. Back in 1990, the students at Wellesley College voted on their commencement speaker. And Barbara Bush actually came in second behind a woman named Alice Walker, who was a popular author at the time, author of The Color Purple. And in 1990, we were in the middle of what some people called third wave feminism. So with it, you have to think about Madonna, singer-songwriter Madonna. And third wave feminism was kind of characterized by young women on college campuses with this kind of like in-your-face attitude. So just the kind of women we would expect to find perhaps at Wellesley. But as it happened, Alice Walker declined the invite, and so Mrs. Bush was invited. And meanwhile, the Wellesley students signed a petition saying that they were opposed to the First Lady selection. They wrote, "Wellesley teaches us that we will be rewarded on the basis of our merit, not on that of a spouse." And again, you kind of sense this opinion that first ladies are kind of not real government officials necessarily. But I've always found it interesting that Barbara Bush did come in second in that poll. There was something about her that was resonating with those women. It shows that how in so many ways she was able to transcend politics. Women, young and old, Republican and Democrat, celebrated Barbara Bush for how she embraced her age. Third wavers, in particular, really wanted to get the message across that aging in women was beautiful. But nevertheless, some Wellesley women asked for a graduation speaker with more quote-unquote self-affirming qualities. And it just so happened that Raisa Gorbachev, who was the Soviet First Lady equivalent, was going to be in Washington at the time. So, in contrast with Mrs. Bush, Mrs. Gorbachev was the mother of one and a university lecturer. And also Soviet First Ladies have not historically been expected to assume a lot of such a public role as our American First Ladies have. So anyway, Mrs. Bush invited her to come. While Mrs. Gorbachev's speech is long forgotten, Mrs. Bush's lives on as an outstanding example of American rhetoric. From her use of humor to her self-deprecation, she connected with her audience, both at Wellesley and her television audience, because it was broadcast, because it had generated so much publicity at the time. Barbara Bush started her speech. This is what she said. She said, "Now I know your first choice today was Alice Walker, known for the color purple. Instead you got me, known for the color of my hair." But my favorite line was her anecdote about her friend whose husband griped about babysitting his own children. Barbara Bush said, "When it's your own kids, it's not called babysitting." So I think Barbara Bush will be remembered as the First Lady of Family Values. Though she's often called, and we're remembering her as a traditional First Lady, we have to remember that she was not behind her time. She was exactly right for it, as all of our First Ladies have been. Thank you. So I would be happy to take your questions.
In your introduction, you mentioned that there are no federal guidelines for First Ladies.
Right.
And it sounds like from your conclusion that you like it that way. If that's a wrong interpretation, I'd like to know that. But the other thing you mentioned in the introduction and the Pat Nixon quote is that it's an unpaid position. And you quote Betty Ford, or you mentioned that Betty Ford said the First Lady deserved to earn a salary.
Yeah.
She reasoned, quote, has long hours and lots of responsibilities, but I would have had it so that a First Lady can't collect unless she works, unquote.
Oh, yeah.
A two-pronged question then.
Sure.
Have there been any efforts, solid efforts in that direction to establish pay rather than just expenses and things for the First Lady? Right. And secondly, how would you feel about that the First Lady should get a salary?
Oh, those are great questions. Thank you very much. I thank you for mentioning that quote from Betty Ford. She did think the First Lady but she did say you're not. If you don't work, you're not going to get paid. So there have not been, that I know of, any real efforts to get a salary for the First Lady. So I think the answer to the second prong of your question is no, not that I know of. And there actually have been. There are no constitutional guidelines about the First Lady's role, but that's not to say that there are zero federal guidelines about the First Lady's role. In the 1970s, Congress did pass an act appropriating funds for the work of the president's spouse. It actually has gender-neutral language. So the First Lady's staff and her efforts do have money, though she herself does not collect any money through that. But it does kind of acknowledge the work that she does, and through the money that's appropriated for her work. So there is federal money to support the work of herself and her staff. And there's also the 1993-1994 cases. There were a couple of them. American Association of Physicians and Surgeons versus Hillary Clinton. And this was the federal lawsuit where the American Association of Physicians and Surgeons sued the Clinton administration because they thought that because the First Lady was leading the health care reform task force, the meetings had to be open door. And so in that case, the federal government did rule that the First Lady's office was they called it a de facto government position. And so if you kind of if you read that opinion, it's really interesting because they kind of go through the history of the First Lady's office and talk about everything the First Ladies have done. So there are no definitions, but our federal law does kind of sort of recognize it. Did I answer your questions?
In terms of your personal opinion.
Oh, my opinion. Oh, that's a good question. Nobody's ever asked me that before. But yeah, I think the hard thing, I wouldn't be opposed to it, certainly, but it's also kind of, I agree with Betty Ford that if you're going to get paid, you have to work. And since the First Lady, they don't have to do anything, right? And even our current First Lady has done, she's done some things, but not on the scale of, say, Hillary Clinton or Laura Bush even. So I think it would be hard to determine fairness in pay for something like that. But if there was a way you could work out how it could be equitable, I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to it, But that's a great question. Thank you.
Could I ask the second one or no?
Sure.
Okay. You mentioned Barbara Bush's Wellesley speech, and in that, of course, she mentioned presidential spouse. And
yes, of course.
And I'm just wondering, do you anticipate that a first gentleman, or whatever the term would be, that role could be different in terms of the 6 things you mentioned in your conclusion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think probably, it probably will happen. I think I'll probably see it in my lifetime. And I think that person will have a lot of freedom to innovate. And I actually wrote the book because, I thought I would be having to include a chapter on Bill eventually, but that didn't happen. So it would change the whole thing. But I certainly think so. But it would be interesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good question. Other questions? You can tell me who your favorite First Lady was. Tell me your opinions. Eleanor, yeah. Yeah.
She was ahead of her time.
You think? Yeah.
She was anti-racist. She had a job.
I think you're supposed to go to the microphone.
Oh, shoot.
That's what I was supposed to tell you. You have to go to the microphone.
Yeah.
Is that right, Elaine?
I've always thought Eleanor Roosevelt was ahead of her time.
Yeah.
She had a job. She said she was going to earn as much money as her husband did. She spoke out against racism. I forgot the African-American singer who was supposed to be singing at the Washington Monument.
Right.
And she was sponsored by this organization, and she quit that organization.
Yes, the DAR, sure.
She tried to influence her husband on, I think she was more liberal and more progressive than her husband was.
Right,
So
I
always viewed her as a first lady who was ahead of her time.
Yes. Thank you very much. I think, and I love people who disagree with me because I'm an academic and like to debate. And I think those are very good points. Those are excellent points.
And also, she wasn't a very good mother.
Yeah, she was a maybe based on how her kids turned out, but just a quick response. She moved though within this circle, and so kind of like in the broader culture, the broader American culture, I can see that point, but she kind of moved within a very, it was the progressive movement. She came out of the progressive movement in American politics, which was mainstream to an extent. So, I think, but very good point. Thank you. Yes.
A few years before you started with Mrs. Hoover,
Okay.
I was thinking of Mrs. Wilson.
Mrs. Wilson, yeah.
And some people call her America's first female president.
Right.
And she took over a lot of her husband's duties because of his illness.
That's right.
I was wondering if you could comment on her.
Yeah, she was. That is true about Mrs. Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had 2 wives. The first one died while he was president, and he was grieving, and kind of pretty quickly after she died, he met his second wife, and was, I think, a great support to him during the war, and really sustained his spirits, and he was obviously very depressed and grieving after his first wife died. So she was, I don't cover her, I haven't really researched her in my book, but yes, many people do call her the first female president because she did take over the reins of government while her husband was incapacitated. So yes, that's not myth, that's true. And she's interesting. She also, during the war, did a whole, war garden, and was very, she put her Hoover stickers that Herbert Hoover was the food czar during the First World War, and displayed those in the White House to try to be a good role model for the homemakers of the country. So that kind of role in supporting homemakers, I think, dates back before even Mrs. Hoover, of course. But thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. That's a great question. Hi, Joel.
How are you doing?
Fine.
So I think it's extremely interesting that you brought up Mrs. Gorbachev here tonight.
Yes.
Because she is an aberration when it comes to the wives of Soviet premiers.
Oh, for sure.
I'd like for maybe if you could kind of comment on the role of the First Lady in relation to other countries.
Okay.
On the difference between the American First Lady and other First Ladies for France or Great Britain that maybe you've come across in your research.
So what are the relationships between them?
The differences between what our First Lady does as part of whether it's the handshaking, different types of platforms or performances as opposed to other countries.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that's a good question. My sense is that American First Ladies are kind of expected to do quite a lot in terms of a public role, perhaps more than in most countries. As I mentioned before, the Soviet First Ladies back in the 60s, I can't remember. I was trying to figure out where I read this. It might have been in Jacqueline Kennedy's oral history, but don't quote me on that. But nobody really even knew that they had wives. They didn't know. And kind of, and I'll just say this, because I've always wanted to say it to an audience, is that if I ever could meet Melania Trump, because she grew up in the former Yugoslavia, former communist country, and she doesn't do quite as much, of course, as, I'm not criticizing, but she doesn't do quite as much as Eleanor Roosevelt or even Mamie Eisenhower even. If I could ask her, the very first question I would ask her would be, what was your model, no pun intended, growing up as First Lady? Because my sense is that she probably, back growing up in the former Soviet country, she probably didn't have one. Her Hillary Clinton didn't come to her high school and talk about healthcare reform, right? So, if I could have an audience with her, that's what I would ask her. The British Prime Minister's wife, again, I don't think quite as public of a role. Husband, sorry, you're right. But when they were, she's not married, I don't, Theresa May isn't married. Oh, she is, yes, yeah, she is, I'm sorry. What? Yeah, Margaret Thatcher was married, and Dennis Thatcher. But when the UK Prime Minister has been male, my sense is not that they've, gone, that they have the same kind of public role as the American First Lady has, right? The Queen is the head of state there, you're right. Another question? Yes.
We went to the Truman White House in Key West, Florida, many years ago, and the tour guide was talking about how his mother-in-law never really thought he was good enough for her daughter.
Yeah,
and had
true.
no qualms in telling him, or I don't know, he just would tell us these anecdotes about her. So I just
thank you. Yeah, that's a great point, because actually Harry Truman and Bess Truman were not kind of from the same social class. She kind of moved in I wouldn't say like Eleanor Roosevelt's level in New York City, but she moved in the upper echelons of Independence, Missouri society. And he really pursued her for many years before she finally conceded to marry him. But yeah, those stories they're very true. Those are great stories. Yes?
Two questions, if that's okay.
Yeah,
my first question is, why did you choose to start the book with Mrs. Hoover and not like earlier?
Okay, that's a great question. Well, one reason is that Herbert Hoover has a presidential library, and I've always wanted to go to West Branch, Iowa in the middle of winter. The Roosevelt Library, Franklin Roosevelt was the first president to start construction on his library. Then I was told when I spoke at the FDR Library last summer that Herbert Hoover saw what was going on up at FDR and wanted one of his own. But no, the real reason is that I think Lou Hoover is fascinating. It was a struggle for me where to start, because there's no, again, free to disagree with me here, there's no one great place to start this. I could have started it in 1920 with Florence Harding, in the early 1920s with Florence Harding. But I chose Lou Hoover, one, because I couldn't write a book that long. My publisher wouldn't let me. And I really do genuinely think she's a fascinating woman, and she really is eclipsed by Eleanor Roosevelt. She was active while she was in office, and so I wanted to give her the attention that I felt like she deserved. That's a very good question. And what's your second question?
Was Miss Truman criticized for not liking the receiving lines?
Oh yeah, oh absolutely, because this is post-war America. And the press, it's post-war recovery, kind of. But they wanted to know, they wanted to know, all the information. What are the what are the tablecloths like? Just how much does she weigh? Did you lose 20 pounds over the summer? Those kinds of questions, and she just was not forthcoming. But you had a women's press corps at the time that was really hungry for those details. Eleanor Roosevelt gave them tremendous access, and and Bess Truman gave them no access. And so the press women didn't like it, and there's a pretty famous, you can probably find it online, I'm guessing. It's this, one of the publications did an article on her. It's one page, and the title of the article is "No Comment." And it's just, what they did was reprinted every question the press corps sent to Mrs. Truman. And for most of the answers, she gives no comment, no comment, no comment. So that was, I think, kind of a way of like sticking it to her by reprinting that. It's one of the most, I think, well-known things about Bess Truman, and I think has been kind of stuck with this image as very reticent, which was true, but not as true as I think her historical reputation would indicate. But that's a great question. Thank you.
My question is regarding the oft-forgotten Rosalind Carter.
Oh, yes, Mrs. Carter, of course.
And I wonder if time allows, could you share for a few moments
yes.
the role that she played in public as well as her personality?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you. I would have talked, I think you would probably start falling asleep if I talked about every single First Lady. So I tried to limit it. Do you have a Rosalind Carter related question? Yes.
Having met with Eleanor
Roosevelt
on many occasions, I'm surprised that Eleanor Roosevelt has not received more attention in your presentation.
Oh, thanks. Okay, I'll answer that question in a second. But about Rosalind Carter, and then I'll answer about Eleanor Roosevelt. Sorry, I thought the two were related. But so Rosalind Carter really wanted to be an equal partner in the White House. She would get dressed in the morning, pack up her briefcase, and go to work. And she and the president had working lunches. And she was, of course, she was the second First Lady to have an official government appointment after Eleanor Roosevelt as chairperson of the Task Force on Mental Health Reform. And so that was a job that she took very seriously, traveled kind of like she did what Hillary Clinton did, maybe to a slightly smaller extent, but would travel around the country and try to her ultimate goal was to get a law passed to reform mental health care, and she was successful to some degree. And so she wanted to convey the image, which was very much in line with the times, that she was a working mother, and she did the diplomatic trips just like Pat Nixon did, acted as the official representative when she would travel on behalf of her husband as the representative of the head of state. So she was very active as First Lady. So yeah, is that did I do a good enough job? Okay, but I think she's and her ERA activism was. I think that I'll talk about her ERA activism for just 1 second, because she did the same thing as Betty Ford. Betty Ford really set the precedent, and Rosalind Carter tried to keep it really quiet. She was picketed outside the White House by Phyllis Schlafly, as I told you, but I think she wanted to try to avoid a lot of that public confrontation about the ERA because it was so. It had become so controversial by the late 1970s. But there was the Houston Conference in November of 1977, where the three First Ladies, Betty Ford, Rosalind Carter, and Lady Bird Johnson, all went to Houston for this big women's rights conference they had, and Phyllis Schlafly had a corresponding conference in the same city, right, like 5 miles away at the time, and so that was kind of like that was another big confrontation, but that was really a remarkable picture of the first ladies. It's not in the public domain. I can't find a public domain image that is, but I thought of putting it in there, of the 3 first ladies kind of holding the ERA torch together in Houston, Texas. Now, Rose, your question is about Eleanor Roosevelt. You know what? You had the same criticism that one of my dissertation advisors had, because she was an Eleanor Roosevelt scholar. And she said, you know, part of me just can't wrap my mind around how you've minimized her. And my intention wasn't to minimize her. I wanted to give all first ladies equal treatment in my book. And if you read it, you'll see that all first ladies are treated with about the same amount of space. And so I didn't want to, though Eleanor Roosevelt, I mean, she was first lady for the longest period of time. She did a tremendous amount. I mean, just so, and if you look at her White House portrait, I love her White House portrait because it's a picture of Eleanor, and then it's a picture of like her doing, she's busy with her hands, working, doing this and that. And she was very, just very busy and very active. And I could have, you know, volumes have been written about her. But again, my contract was 90,000 words. And I could not go over 90,000 words, including footnotes. I had to cut 60,000 words out of it. At the end, I wrote and wrote and wrote, and they were like, "That's too long," and it was. But that's a good question. So you and my dissertation advisor are thinking right along the same wavelength. So that's good. Yes.
The question is about Michelle Obama. I don't remember the details, but I think I remember that early on in the presidency that she was much more outspoken, and it seemed to me that she was pretty quickly, I don't know what happened behind the scenes, but it seemed like she pretty quickly took a much lower profile and was much more cautious about what she said. So I wanted to know a little bit of the backstory.
That is true, and you know, that's something that when we, you know, I hear a lot of criticism, again, about Melania Trump not doing much. But we have to also remember that Michelle Obama also really limited her public schedule, especially when she first got into the White House. She had 2 young girls, and she wrote a letter to the American public before the inauguration saying that my job is going to be first mom. So she was kind of putting the public on notice that I'm not going to be there. It was kind of like the Jacqueline Kennedy, I'm not going to be there, you know, out front and doing all of these things that you might like me to do because I have 2 young girls, and my priority is going to be getting them acclimated to life in Washington. So she did, you know, she kind of set that expectation, and you're correct to say that she did limit. I think she kind of picked it up. That's my perception anyway, that she kind of picked it up as the years went on. And her girls got a little bit older. But, you know, in the same way, I think Melania Trump is kind of focused also when, she has a young son, and she too is focused on being a mom, as all our first ladies with young children have been. But yeah, I think, you know, Michelle Obama was very professional. She, of course, was a trained lawyer, right, and a hospital executive. And so she had pretty high standards for her staff. I remember listening to a podcast about somebody who's working in the Obama administration, and said when you were out, like if you were on a state visit somewhere, you were working. You know, if you were dancing the conga line, you were working. You know, that was work. It wasn't like this. But so she was, I think, pretty strict and ran a tight ship, from what I've heard. But yeah, that's a great point. Last question.
Sort of adds on maybe to the comments you made about Melania.
Yes.
And Mrs. Obama. And also somebody asked a question about other countries. Right. And it reminded me, I believe that Tony Blair's wife was a high-powered lawyer. Yes. And continued to do that. So my question is your thoughts about if you foresee or how you would picture in America either a president, a male president whose wife, say, is a corporate lawyer or a corporate president, or vice versa, a female president whose husband has his own life and who basically sort of says, like Melania, this is great, you want to be president? I'll come and visit, sort of thing, but I've got my life, And if you think the American people, how do you think the American people might react to something like that?
So you mean to a first lady who kind of, I'm gonna go do my job.
Or a first gentleman.
Or a first gentleman.
Who wants to pursue, who really doesn't want to be first spouse.
Right.
First,
yeah.
first partner.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, because you would think that as the spouse, well, first of all, we in America, Martha Washington, let's go all the way back. And then we'll start at the beginning, and I'm going to keep you here for another 3 hours. No, Martha Washington really set the expectation that the wife of the spouse of the president was going to do something, right? It was very different back when but she was there. She was a presence. She coordinated, it was ceremonial and social back then, but she set the standard. Abigail Adams followed. Other presidents who didn't have wives, like Thomas Jefferson, and had surrogates who would come in and kind of serve those roles. And so it just goes back to the roots of our culture. It's hard for me to even kind of fathom that. But, with women's changing roles, who knows? It's possible. Do I think that the American people would love it? No. I would think that if you're the spouse of the president, if the public thinks that you should be doing something, you would try to kind of like the first rule, do no harm, right? And you don't want to generate a lot of criticism. So I'd think that, given the expectation is there and is so deeply rooted, that, if you're the spouse of the president, male or female, you would want to do what you could to support that if that's the public's expectation of you. But I could also see a point in time where, maybe the first gentleman or the first lady who wants to maybe keep up his or her career, in the meantime. And again, back to one of the first things, there is no constitutional role, right? She doesn't, or he doesn't have to do anything. But, we have all of this history that would tell us that she actually, or he actually really has to. So it's a tough call. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw something like that in the future, though. That's a great question. Great question. Well, thank you all very much.
We have a gift of pens with President Ford's signature, and wonderful. She can use them for the book signing for the books that you're all eager to buy if you haven't already.
Sure.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And so this was a wonderful tribute to Betty Ford. Thank you so much. And in honor of all of our First Ladies. So this was great, and the questions were great. So I'm glad you finally got the idea of going to the microphone. So you're a little slow on that tonight, ladies and gentlemen, but we'll expect more in the future. Before we close, just a couple of things. We have a condolence book for Mrs. Barbara Bush in the lobby. If you wish to sign or write a note to the family, we will be sending that to the Bush family. So we hope you'll sign that. That's on your left. Take a look at the new Betty Ford Centennial exhibit. It's to your left. We have head of state gifts, some wonderful jewelry, ladies and gentlemen, to give ideas. On the left, in front of the coat closet area. And of course, in the lobby, the exhibit cases, and on the wall, lots of photographs. So we hope you'll take a look at that, and if not tonight, then come back to see us. We have information about joining Friends of Ford, and we hope you will consider doing that, and also the possibility of your signing up for email announcements of our programs. And we also have a flyer listing the upcoming programs that are already scheduled, and of course more are in process. So now, stick around for a while, look at the exhibit, meet our author, and we look forward to seeing you back in May for Scott Kaufman. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you.